Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. Today's episode is really exciting because in this house, there are several really beautiful plaster kind of cornices that go around the light fixtures, and there are also several rooms that don't have them. So I decided to see if I could go about figuring out how to make one myself. The medallion that I want to use as a reference for what I'm going to create is actually the one that I painted in the guest room in a previous episode. What I'm doing now is I'm just measuring out every single thing that I could possibly need to recreate this upstairs on paper. In order to get an idea of what the silhouette of my mold is going to need to be, I'm using a contour gauge on this original plaster just to kind of get a sense of those highs and lows. I first got the idea to do this by following an amazing account on Instagram by a company called CSJ Bespoke Plaster Moldings, and they have such an amazing account. If you don't follow them, you should. Anyhow, they basically show how they're making these things, and I didn't obviously know before I started this at all how this was done. And so after watching their videos for probably several years, I started thinking, I wonder if I could do that at home. It doesn't seem impossible. And so I finally decided to give it an attempt. One thing I should also mention is that contour gauge is really only a jumping off point. You can't get anything too refined from it. So once I had kind of gotten the general idea, then I could actually start smoothing it out and customizing the shape to fit what I wanted. What I did next was put some painter's tape over a sheet of acrylic plexi, and now I'm drawing out the silhouette and I'm going to cut out this shape on a scroll saw. The painter's tape actually achieves two different things. The first is obviously it is a surface that you can draw on, so it's ideal for drawing out the silhouette. And then the second thing is it stops the blade from potentially scratching or making anything too rough on your actual acrylic. And so it's just kind of a nice buffer. Now that I have that basic sheet of the mold, I actually need to create a cage to enclose it in. And so what I'm doing right here is I'm just cutting out a board and cutting kind of big kind of rainbow shape out of the top. And I'm going to be able to set this right in there. And so I'll have all of the stability of the board without any of that wood getting in the way. I'm now drilling in 2 different cuts of wood on each side of that arched cut wood piece. And this is basically going to stop it from rocking or shifting around. I've mentioned this before, but you always want to pre-drill when you're doing something like this. Years ago, I never did just because it seemed like an annoying extra step, but it makes a huge difference in how the whole thing comes together. Once the cage was assembled, I then took some hot glue, put it all over that arched piece, and then pressed down my mold. Now that my sculpting mold is made, the next step is to create several tracks for this to slide on in order to make the kind of curved and bent pieces that I'm going to need. What I decided to do first was to sketch out kind of a rough silhouette of what I was thinking and mark all of my measurements, and this way I have something visual to reference as I work on each of these pieces. The easiest track to make is going to just be a circle, so I'm tapping in a nail right into the center. I'm going to take some of this wire and wrap it around that nail in such a way that it can easily slide and it doesn't actually start coiling. Then I'm going to mark one of my points and wrap the wire around that. Then I'm going to clamp this down, and what that does is it creates a guide loop. And once you put a pencil in there, you just slide it all the way around and you end up with a perfect circle. The initial circle is only the widest area of where the actual plaster creation is going to be. And now I need to create the track mark, which is going to be about 3/4 of an inch outside of that and 3/4 of an inch inside the design. This next track is the very hardest because I've got to figure out a method for creating a perfectly smooth bend, and I'm going to do my very best to explain how I figured this out. The track I'm creating is actually for this longer outer curve that you see right there, and I measured and it's 44 inches across, and then directly up from that straight line would be about 2 inches. So basically what you've got here is a very small piece of a large circle. And now what I need to do is figure out where the center of that circle is and determine how far away it is from this curve. Because I'm not very good at math, I'm going to do this a very dumb way, but a very effective way. So what I'm doing is taping 2 pieces of paper together. I'm going to tap in a nail and wrap the wire around it. Back on that piece of paper, I've marked 44 inches across. And now what I need to do is just keep shifting the paper up until the exact same length of wire, when pulled taut, touches both the end and beginning of my measurement. Once I knew for sure I had it right, I crimped that wire and made that little loop. And now I'm able to take my pencil and draw from one end to the next, and I end up with this really beautiful, perfect curve. After that, I was able to move the paper down and really actually start drawing out this track. Just like the circle, that first initial line was only the outer marking for the plaster that I'm creating. And so now for the track, I just need to measure 3/4 of an inch outside of that, draw that line, figure out what that interior measurement needs to be, bend the wire again, and mark that as well. With the drawing stage done, now I can just cut these out and then lay them down on some wood, mark all of that, and then I'm just going to use my jigsaw and cut out these shapes. For this donut one, it's really nice to just drill a hole right in the center, and this way you can just easily put the blade in there and start going. The next thing you need to do is sand the sides of these down really well, because if there are any imperfections or flaws, they will ultimately be magnified in your finished pieces. I have a large sheet of plywood here that I'm going to be setting on top of a table, and so I am just gluing my tracks down onto this. One thing I will tell you that I learned the hard way is you want your tracks closer to the edge, because what I'm doing here, where it's kind of far inward, doesn't really work because you end up obviously like leaning over really far, and that becomes unpleasant. I had a little bit of drywall tape laying around, and so that's what I ended up using for this next step. Essentially what I'm creating here is a barrier between the wood and the finished plaster, because I'm pretty sure if I were to just mold the plaster directly onto the wood, I would very likely break it once I tried to pry it off. Finally, I get to start mixing plaster of Paris. And you always fill your trowel with water first. And you can get these 25-pound bags of plaster of Paris from Lowe's for like $22. And I think this project overall maybe only took 6 or 7 of those bags, which when you think of how expensive like home restoration projects can be, this is pretty inexpensive as far as they go. When it comes to actually mixing the plaster, I don't think you need exact measurements. Essentially, the texture you're shooting for is something a little bit thinner than like a standard pudding and a little bit thicker than maybe a hollandaise sauce. Once my first batch was down, I smoothed it out just a little bit, and then you can just take your track and start sliding it around. You really don't have a ton of time to play around with plaster once you've mixed it. So I would work in kind of smaller batches because then if something happens and something doesn't work out, you don't end up really wasting any. So for the sake of making an enjoyable video, I'm only going to show you all of the things that worked out really well because there were a million times that this mold would stick and I would have to kind of fight with it. And don't even get me started on what a mess this creates. You honestly have to clean up all of the plaster after every single batch. Otherwise, your work area will start to look like the Grand Canyon. But when you see the finished result, it very quickly becomes apparent that all of this trouble is worth it. A lesson that I had to learn the hard way, unfortunately, is that you need to scrape off every little bit of excess plaster because on the outside of the track, it'll start to very slowly build up and then it dries and you don't really see it. And then what happens is when you try to slide your little track along, it starts raising and distorting what you're making. As the layers started building up, I could see it taking shape and it was so exciting. And another nice thing is there isn't a massive amount of waste because any excess that you see once you push it all the way around can easily just be scooped back onto your track and worked into your piece. As it built higher and higher, I found that thinner plaster was working a lot better. The thicker stuff is great for the bottom, but it sets up pretty quickly, and you kind of want a little bit more wiggle room as you get closer to the top. Adjusting the thickness or thinness of the plaster is almost the easiest thing ever, just because if it's a little bit too thin, you just add a little bit more plaster, and if it's a little bit too thick, you just add a little bit more water. The closer I got to the top, the harder it was to wiggle this thing all the way around. And like I mentioned, that Instagram account that I love, they're just sliding it along. Everything looks perfect, but I'm sure they have tons of trade secrets on how to do this and what to avoid. And virtually everything you're seeing here, I'm just kind of winging. But the nice thing is, regardless of that, the finished result looks exactly how I wanted and actually matches the other moldings that I see here around the house. So the techniques I'm using probably aren't terribly far off from how they did it in the 1860s. How neat is this looking? It's just coming along so beautifully. So generally, I don't use sped up footage in the episodes just because I feel like it sort of generates a frantic feeling and I don't like that. But if you tackle this yourself, I don't want there to be any missteps or anything that you didn't see happen. So for that reason, let's watch this whole thing quickly happen from one stationary spot. A tip I didn't mention earlier is that you do want all of the tape laying one after the other. And what this will do is it will prevent the track from catching on it on those first few passes. To ensure that this would temporarily stay still and not move around on me, I took hot glue and I took some blue tape on the outsides, and anywhere I saw blue tape, I knew I'd put a little hot glue. And this way, when I come in to remove this thing, I know exactly the points to slide in to pry that glue apart. One thing that I'm not including here in this sped up montage is the cleanup, just because I sat and watched it and even sped up, it was just brutal to sit through. And so just keep in mind that the cleanup takes maybe 75% of the time, and then all of this fun stuff is the last 25%. Oh, there was something else really important I needed to share. So, this circle that I'm creating has a bit of a bar on the outside. And what I realized once I had made all of my pieces was, oh, I need two circles actually that have that bar going on the inside to fully create the design. So, the way that I achieved that was I actually unscrewed both sides that go on my mold, swapped them, and then just basically reversed the mold. So I ended up with this exact same thing, but the bar was on the inside. Once you get really close to the end, your plaster should be really, really thin, and this just allows you to fill in any little air pockets or holes. To pry them off, all you need to do is slide a spatula under those areas where you did the hot glue. And once you've done that, it should just slide right off. They're still very delicate at this stage, so take your time and be very gentle with them. So before moving these, you want to make sure that they have at least about 10 hours to set up. Otherwise, this can happen. And this happened a couple times before I finally learned my lesson. And speaking of mistakes, let me tell you why I used the plexiglass and not just a board of wood, which was my initial thought. So when I very first started the project, I was like, oh, I'll just do this out of a piece of cut wood. And as I started, it was working beautifully and I was so excited. And then as it started building up, it finally got to a place where it locked. I tried everything I could think of and it just wasn't going to let go. So the mold and this first attempt both sadly ended up in the trash. Thankfully, once I switched over to the plexi, it was pretty much smooth sailing. After all of my circles were made, I was now able to move on to this curved piece. The steps were essentially the same. I will just tell you that this is much easier. Working those tight circles, it just catches a little bit more and it's just kind of a bit more of a struggle. And anything that you're dealing with that's either straight or just slightly curved like this just goes a lot easier. In my initial configuration of the tracks, I had placed this like just directly across, and I actually tried making a few this way, and it just almost murders your back. So having it right alongside you is so much better. As far as I know, there's no toxic side effects of working with plaster of Paris, and so many of the people I see working with it online aren't wearing masks or respirators. But for my own peace of mind, I'd rather just be safe than sorry, and I don't know, death is already going to be unpleasant enough. I'd rather not egg it on. While we're on the topic of protection, something really great to keep in mind is don't wear anything you care about when you work on something like this, just because the plaster is going to get all over it and it doesn't completely wash out. If you find that it really starts to become tricky to pull all the way through, what I found worked best was just to make multiple passes and kind of force it through over and over and over again. And for some reason, that seemed to just work out any kinks. Another trick that I found worked wonders was just taking a brush with some water and hydrating any areas that were giving me too much trouble. once more, just for the sake of fun, let's watch this whole process sped through. So the total number of pieces that I need is 2 of these bent pieces, 2 of the standard circles, 2 of the inverted circles where that bar is kind of closer to the center, and then 2 of the straight planks. Once I have all of that, the last thing I need to do is really simple, thankfully, and that's just to create these little smaller pieces that go right in the center. This was absolutely so much easier than that outer part, because all I needed to do was just make this tiny little dome shape and a little cage for it. Everything was just on a much smaller scale. Something great to keep in mind if you decide to tackle this is your design doesn't necessarily have to be as complicated as the one I just did. What I'm creating here is really simple and it's going to create something really beautiful. So if you're feeling hesitant or a little unsure, just creating a mold that doesn't have a bunch of locks and keys, if it's just sort of like humps and things like that, it will make something beautiful, but it will also slide very easily and not give you anywhere near as much trouble. As an example of how much more simple this one was, it only took 3 passes to get it right. All right, I have all of my pieces and this just worked out so well. Before I started, I wasn't even sure that this was going to be possible. And also, this is easily the hardest part of this project. So the next episode, which is going to be coming in just a couple of days, is going to cover how to install these on the ceiling. So thankfully, you won't have to wait long to see that. So until then, take care of yourselves and I'll see you again very soon.